Hello. Um, I've been doing some transmission work on my wife's 2004 Cadillac SRX with 3.6 liter V6. Um, and it has the 5L40E transmission, which is used in many GM products and BMW. It's pretty good transmission, but it had a valve problem that burnt out the torque converter. So I pulled out the transmission, put in a torque converter, and also replaced um, the 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 torque converter lockout solenoid, which um, provides pressure to the torque converter to lock it out. And without proper pressure on it, the torque converter slips. In this case, and that overheated the transmission. And a lot of times with transmissions, I mean, you could, if I continued to drive the darn thing, it would have burned the whole thing up. But a lot of times you can just replace parts, and most of the time when you take a transmission in that has a problem, they aren't going to spend the time to do that. They just put a new transmission in. I was quoted a price for $3,500 for this. I could have bought a rebuilt one for $2,500 and did it myself. I didn't want to do that again. Or I could have tried to troubleshoot it. In this case, I did pull the transmission out, kind of looked around a little bit, and um, there's other videos that shows me pulling the pan off it and stuff. I didn't make a video of the actual transmission change because I'm kind of a rookie at this. But I pulled the transmission, put a new torque converter in it, and change out the torque converter lockout solenoid, thinking maybe that would help it, but it didn't. It did help it quite a bit, actually. But it actually had an intermittent problem. One time my wife and the son were out driving, and when the lockout solenoid wouldn't engage, it like chattered, and it started slipping and overheated. It just did that one time. And then they got home, let it cool off. Got home. I took it out for a drive, and it was fine. I was like, huh, it's an intermittent problem. Well, that's probably the solenoid that sends the pressure to the torque converter, because one, I just replaced the torque converter, and fortunately they had the presence of mind not to continue driving the thing, so it didn't burn itself out. But so what do I do now? I already replaced the torque converter, and then I replaced the solenoid valve. Well, the next thing I want to do is replace the valve body. Again, I didn't want to, I'm trying to avoid spending lots of money, and when I had the transmission apart a little bit, I looked it through there, and it didn't look like it was in too bad a shape. Kind of took a chance. Again, if I would have burned out the transmission or something else was wrong with it, then I could have been just wasting my time and money. But I think I pretty much got it. Now, what I want to do is kind of show you around the valve body on the 5L40E. And again, I'm just a rookie. I'm learning as we go here. But I'll kind of point out some things I kind of figured out. So this is the 5L40E valve body that I pulled off my car. I put the rebuilt one in, and it seemed to be fine. I found a rebuilt one. Rock Auto had it for $400, and I looked around a little bit on eBay. They had this remanufactured one for like 180 with all said and done. So I tried that, and it seemed to work so far. Anyways, it works fine. But this was actually pretty easy to change out. You had to pull off the oil pan underneath the car, and right now this is sitting upside down. But you pull off the transmission oil pan, and this particular one has a drain plug. Thank goodness. Some of them don't, but this one's not too bad. And then there's 7 bolts that attach it. You can see there's one hole here, one there, one up here. Then there's 3 over here. These 2 bolts here are help holding it together, so you don't take those out. And then these 2 bolts here, this one holds this manual shift arm on, and then this one actually attaches to the underside of the transmission, so you have to take this one off as well. But you can leave this one on there because that's just attaching it to the valve body itself. The valve body is controlled by solenoid valves, and this particular one over here, this solenoid valve is for the lockout for the torque converter, and that's what I was particularly concerned with. And then you have shift solenoids over here, and there's another one up here. But what that does is redirects hydraulic fluid. So there's an electric function and a valve function within the valve, and then also the valve body itself. You got a bunch of ball bearings and stuff in there that that drives hydraulic fluid between channels and provides a shifting mechanism. So if you have a problem of a vehicle shifting, it's probably within the valve body, and that's, again, I'm just a rookie trying to figure this out, but I think that's what was my particular problem. And for me, since it was a torque out lockout problem, and this valve here in particular was the suspect. Now, what I did the first time, as this was upside down in the car, I didn't have to pull it out, but just to change the solenoid, you just pull off this clip here, and then the solenoid just comes right out. I did have to lower, by loosening the bolts, I lowered it down a little bit so this would clear the transmission housing, but that was pretty easy to do. Let's see. On the other side, let me show you the other side of the transmission. On the top side of the valve body, there's really not a whole lot here. All of this pretty much just holds everything together for you, so you don't have to worry about things falling out of it. But basically, there's 5 tubes that made up to the surface here when you bolt the thing up. And then there's a manual shift mechanism over on the other side that the shifter actually connects to, that moves the valving for you. And this diagram here is showing you the tubes. It looks like there's 6 tubes that come down that are, you'll see after you pull the valve body down, that are into the transmission. You can replace those if you want, I guess. It's recommended you do. I didn't. But make sure they don't fall out, because if those aren't in there, it's not going to direct the hydraulic pressure into the transmission. But they're just rubber tubes, like almost hard plastic tubes, that redirect hydraulic pressure from the valve body in the transmission. And that's about all there is to it. When you shift the car, there's a device that hooks onto this, and your shift mechanism's over here off the side. And there's another device that goes in here that moves this plunger back and forth when you shift the gears. And you can see down in this channel, there's basically the position of this plunger is going to redirect a hydraulic pressure to provide change in gears. And it's also controlled electronically through the solenoids. And frankly, I'm not that familiar with how much is mechanical and how much is electronic, but that's what the solenoid valves do as well, as direct hydraulic pressure for shifting. Anyways, I'll take off this primary solenoid valve, kind of show you how this thing works. You see that there's, based on the position of the solenoid, the pressure can be brought from one section to the other, and just out the end of it as well. So when this pushes into that hole, that cavity, you have pressure coming in, and then also you have, depending on the position of the solenoid valve, it redirects that pressure to the according lanes to operate the transmission. Okay, so I have a 12-volt power source, and this is kind of unspectacular here, but you can check the ohm resistance across it, or if you have a 12-volt power source, you could just hook it up and check to make sure that it works. And you hear that clicking back and forth. That's a solenoid valve that would be redirecting the hydraulic pressure. And if you have a quality tool to hook up to the OBD tool, you can hook that up through the OBD connector in the car and actually operate that, and the transmission shop will be listening for the clicking like that to make sure it electrically works. But I think the point with solenoid valves is you can have one that electrically works, but then physically doesn't move the right valving down in this side, so it doesn't move the hydraulic pressure. And like I said, mine, for whatever reason, it didn't fully engage the lockout solenoid in the torque converter. And I don't know if it was a mechanical part of it. I don't know if it was electrical. It could be electrical connector too. I don't know. But by switching out the valve body, I kind of just eliminated a whole bunch of mechanical parts. And the solenoid valve, I think, was working. But the only other thing it could be is electrical connector coming in, or the valve body itself, or something is not directing hydraulic pressure correctly. Fortunately, and hopefully, it'll work now. We took it out for a couple short test drives and it was fine, so that's a good sign. So here's a diagram of the bolts you need to take apart to get the thing off. Looking at the bottom, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's 4 over on this side as well. Then these two bolts here, this one in particular, that one needs to come out. This one here can stay in, and then it'll come out. The other thing I forgot to mention was that it takes a E-socket, and this is like a Torx socket to get these particular bolts out. And then these two here are the male Torx, which, you know, that's going to be opposite of these. So if you have the socket here to take off these bolts, and then you need a 10 millimeter for this one here, and that's those are the bolts that need to come out. So the point I wanted to make, I was kind of intimidated going into this because I never pulled a valve body. I expected when I pulled this particular one off, there would be little ball bearings going everywhere. And fortunately, when the way this particular transmission is made, all the ball bearings are basically inside the valve body. So when I pulled it apart, it was like it was really not that difficult of a job to do. Just had to drain the transmission fluid, pull on the pan, take off the 7 bolts and leave those 2 in and this one in, and then the electrical connectors, and it came right out. And the only other thing was watching out for those little plastic tubes to make sure they stay in place, so when you put it back together, it can direct the hydraulic pressure properly. So I don't really know what exactly was wrong with my transmission, but I seemed to fix it by replacing the torque converter, because I know I burnt that out because it wasn't shifting properly. In overdrive, like going up a hill, it would like make a bunch of rattling noise and slipping and cause the transmission to overheat. So I had to pull the tranny and I put a torque converter in it, and I changed out the torque converter solenoid, this one, and thinking that would fix it, and it made it better. But it was still it would still shift erratically one time, just intermittently. So I know it's going to do it again since it's an intermittent problem. So in this case, I pulled off the whole valve body and put a remanufactured one on for like less than $200. So that's a whole lot better than $3,500, and we'll see if it fixed it. Now, and like I said, if you had a transmission that's totally toast, you could have bands and stuff that are slipping, and if it's doing it all the time consistently, then that's a mechanical, like a band or a clutch or something that's not working properly. But if you have an intermittent problem that just comes and goes, then that's probably has to do with your valve body. And again, I'm just I'm just guessing here, trying to figure out how this stuff works as I go. So, you know, I'm not a transmission guy. But most of the transmission shops will just throw a transmission on it, and you know, $3,000-4,000 later, you're on your way. I would just as soon try to figure stuff out myself first and see if I can figure this out. But this definitely wasn't that difficult of a job. And like I said, the valve body stayed intact pretty much. And you had 2 connecting points here for your shift mechanism. This one, there's a little rod that comes out and fits in this groove that slides back and forth. And then this lever here just kind of holds the thing in place.